Talk to me a little bit about just first, with the announcement from the president about these enforcement activities in the last few weeks. What um, what have you been hearing? What do you think we should expect to see?
Well, I think the issue of immigration has given President Trump a lot of political traction. So it's a promise that he made, and I think he will deliver on it. He will not deport 11 million undocumented residents currently in the United States, but he's certainly going to deport hundreds of thousands of them. It's about the political theater. It's about a show of force. It's about showing that he's fulfilling his promise. The president is very interested in doing that. He's already deployed members of the military to the U.S.-Mexico border. He's already conducted some raids in work sites, and he's already, of course, sent many migrants towards the border and onto their country. So we should expect this to continue for at least months. The president, I think, will eventually run into obstacles and resistance. But for now, I think he's enjoying a honeymoon, and I think we should expect the same law enforcement activities we've seen in the last week to continue possibly well into 2025.
And because of these activities that we saw specifically in the Houston area this past Sunday, we know since that has happened, we've been hearing from people in the community that said that they are seeing fewer people leaving their homes, going to work, going to grocery stores and stuff. What impact does that have?
Yeah, unfortunately, the law enforcement activities that the government is conducting, policy and law enforcement actions are going to create a lot of suffering. People are going to be afraid of being detected and deported and separated from their families. They're going to live under a lot of stress. They're going to avoid showing up for work, especially if they know that there are worksite raids by ICE and other authorities in the United States. They're certainly living under a lot of anxiety, and I think they're going to avoid being exposed in the streets, being detected. We also have to remember that the Trump administration is forcing many local law enforcement agencies, and that's the case with TPS in Texas and other sheriff's departments throughout the state, as well as city police departments collaborating with the federal government. So at this point, I think the community, the immigrant community in particular, feels very, very vulnerable. And in Houston, we have 600,000 undocumented immigrants, 1.6 million in Texas overall, most of them, as I said, in Houston. So there's going to be a lot of fear, and people are going to prefer to stay in hiding.
I was going to ask you about those numbers. Kind of share with us, where are we getting those numbers from? Is that from the previous census, or exactly where are these numbers coming from?
Yeah, the number tank, not a think tank, but a numeralia tank that I think collects a lot of this information is, of course, the Pew Hispanic Center. They certainly keep an eye on that. They try to do various statistical calculations of the undocumented population. It peaked in 2007 at 12.5 million, and then it's been going down since. Actually, the undocumented population has remained fairly stable for the last decade. And I think at this point, we're looking at some 10.5 million, somewhere between 10.5 and 11 million. That's as close as we can get. I think they have some very good methodology to estimate how many undocumented residents live here. They use the American Community Service, and they use other databases to calculate how many undocumented residents to currently live in the United States.
I believe you said there are roughly 600,000 undocumented immigrants in the Houston area specifically. What impact do they have on the workforce here locally?
Well, several aspects I think are important to consider when it comes to the impact of undocumented residents in our area, in Houston, Texas, in Harris County. Number one, obviously, they are workers, and they tend to populate very specific economic sectors. The construction industry depends heavily on immigrants, and many of them are undocumented immigrants, of course, even though they're not directly employed by construction companies. Sometimes they're employed by brokers who then deliver the labor to construction companies. That's number one. Uh, The second industry, of course, is the hospitality and the food processing restaurants. They depend heavily on these migrants. You often see them in the kitchens of restaurants. You see them as busboys in restaurants. You see them in landscaping. You see them in hospitality and cleaning services and in buildings. Often you see the crews that are cleaning the buildings are also often undocumented migrants. So these actions of detecting and deporting many of these workers are eventually going to result in a slashing part of the workforce of these important industries. And then we may then begin to see the consequences, I think, of extracting so many workers out of the workforce, and projects will not be delivered, foods will not be served, agriculture will not occur. Obviously, they're also employed in agriculture and ranching, so that won't be delivered. That will get done, and I think eventually the attrition rate will begin to affect of law enforcement will begin to affect these industries that we depend on. The second thing that I think it's important to consider when it comes to immigrants is, of course, the fact that they pay taxes. It may not seem like it, but many of them actually pay taxes. Minimally, of course, they pay the 8.25% sales tax on everything they purchase, and many of them actually manage to pay even income tax through the use of stolen or fake Social Security numbers. So they do pay taxes into the system. And the third, and I think really important element that is going to, I think, have an effect on the economy is, of course, that they are consumers. So we're going to see a depression in the consumption of certain goods and services throughout the city, the county, and of course, the country. You cannot pluck out of the workforce 600,000 workers in Houston or 1.6 million workers in Texas or 10.5 million workers in the United States, an important component of our workforce in the country, and not expect real deep consequences. One other item that I think it's important to highlight is, of course, inflation. This is likely if you take workers out of the workforce, then you may have to raise wages to attract people who are unemployed, who actually qualify to work, and that those higher salaries will, of course, translate into higher wages. And then, of course, we have a housing shortage, and you will not have the workers to deliver the home projects or the housing projects, the apartment buildings that are being committed in our economy. And of course, that means delays in projects, and that is also going to represent a poor adjustment in the housing. We'll just simply won't have the apartments and houses that we need. So they're an important part of the economy, and we should expect consequences if this goes on for too long.
Just so I'm clear, the points you kind of reference, workers, paying taxes, consumers, and cause for inflation. Are those the key
Correct.
points? And speaking on inflation, I don't believe people would realize how this could lead to inflation. Could you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
Well, let me put it this way. If you force restaurants in the Houston area, for example, that employ a lot of undocumented workers to go away, then you will have to find the labor force in the population that is in the county, in the city, and that will demand higher wages. Those wages will translate into higher prices, or the lesser number of workers available to those restaurants will jump from job to job, from restaurant to restaurant, demanding ever higher wages. And the restaurants will have to pay those higher wages because to have the employees, you will just have to compensate them at higher rates. That's fine, but then that means that the prices on our menus are eventually going to go up because restaurants will be employing a higher paid labor force.
And people could say, well, this is important to get citizens in these positions, in these roles that could help the overall economy, that higher wages and that sort of thing. How is that a negative? People could ask.
Yes, well, obviously, if we want to pay more for cabbage and strawberries and the food on the menu at a restaurant and the apartment complex, because there'll be a competition for the apartments that are being finished, because most apartments will be delayed, then that's fine. But this is contradictory. President Trump promised that he would bring inflation down under control, and that means a target of 2 to 2.5% per annum. Currently, we're about at 3%, 3.1% or so. If you begin to take workers out of the workforce and force wages up, that's going to push inflation up. So these are contradictory goals. Removing workers from the workforce will force the government, of course, I think, consider that inflation is not going to be easily fought because then prices, wages will be going up. So I think the Trump administration is faced with a number of important policies that have contradictory goals, and controlling inflation, controlling prices, and taking a huge number of workers out of the workforce are certainly contradictory when it comes to controlling inflation. I think at the end of the day, the problem is not even that you take undocumented workers out of the workforce. That's fine. If you prefer to have only documented workers, then what you have to do is to open paths, visa paths for additional workers to come in from Mexico or Central America or other countries to fill in those jobs and make sure that we have enough workers in the country to maintain a level of inflation and a level of employment that's acceptable to our economy. The problem is, of course, that we're taking those workers, sending them away, but we're not opening additional visa paths for new workers.
Tony, are there any other things you'd like to add that I may have failed to ask that you really want our viewers to take away from this whole conversation?
Yeah, for now, I don't see any resistance from society. I don't see any resistance from organizations, from the church or churches. But I think eventually they're going to see the kind of suffering. We're going to see families separated. We're going to see families losing their income because the undocumented member of the family, who's the breadwinner, will be sent away. We're going to see children without their parents who are going to be placed in foster care. We're going to begin to see enough suffering that there will be a big pushback against this mass deportation policy. But I think for now, it's going to happen. It's going to happen for the next few weeks, for the next few months. I think President Trump is emboldened. He made a promise. He's fulfilling that promise. But I think eventually the business community, civil society, the religious community will push back, and then we'll see an equilibrium on this. And of course, maybe Congress will realize that what we need is immigration reform. If they're going to enforce immigration laws, then they certainly need to open up new paths so that we can get the workers that we need in the country.